Brown Octofinals. Pound, 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 pound. And with that, I would like to invite the most august Prime Minister to open up this wonderful round. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
So, Jasper, been a great partner. It's been a great tournament. True friends on side op. We told our novices that if nothing else, they should watch this round so they can see Cody, Sodi, one of the best teams on the circuit. So I'm sure this will be a really great round. Well, it's not sarcasm. So brief case construct. Some American hedge funds engage in a practice that makes them known as vulture funds. When countries are going through economic distress, vulture funds buy the sovereign debt of those countries from other investors. If those countries declare bankruptcy, vulture funds refuse to accept a restructuring of that debt, which is called a haircut, and sue an American court to force the debtor country to pay back its debt. So a case is that the US government should ban American courts from adjudicating foreign governments' obligation to pay sovereign debt to American investors. Sorry, I know.
You need to read all of that again.
Okay.
I'm not sorry.
Yeah. I am sorry. Well, I'll just go through it one more time. So, some American hedge funds engage in a practice that makes them known as vulture funds. When countries are going through economic distress, vulture funds buy the sovereign debt of those countries from other investors. If those countries declare bankruptcy, then vulture funds refuse to accept a restructuring of that debt, which is called a haircut, and sue an American courts to force the debtor country to pay back its debt. One way to think about haircut and why it's kind of called that is because it's the difference between what's paid back and what was initially owed, or like what's actually the value of what is owed. So our case is that the US government should ban American courts from adjudicating foreign governments' obligation to pay sovereign debt to American investors.
Okay. So presumably Congress passes a law, because we may not do this sort of thing. And specifically, what does the law tell you to do instead?
That you can't go to American courts.
Right. So you just cannot settle this kind of case in American court.
Yep.
And describe the terms of this case. Like, what are you excluding?
How do you mean?
So, in this law, how does Congress define the scope of cases that cannot seek justice in the American system?
I'd say when firms engage in the practices described in the case construct. So I think for the purposes of this debate, we'll suggest that we can identify vulture funds.
Okay, so in any case where you refuse to accept a restructuring, then you are a vulture fund that cannot seek justice in American courts.
Well, so it's somewhat more complicated. So some investors will initially refuse a restructuring, but then ask for better terms.
Yes.
But vulture funds are entities that, when it becomes clear that a country is going to go into economic stress, possibly a sovereign debt crisis, they buy up large amounts of that debt from other investors and then hold onto it without even trying to negotiate with the country in question.
Okay, so if at any point you refuse to take the haircut and you've purchased a large amount of debt, then you are designated a vulture fund.
And you were trying to sue in American courts. But we would prohibit them from suing in American courts, so yes.
So the case is that the US government should ban American courts from adjudicating foreign governments' obligation to pay sovereign debt to American investors.
Okay, I'm just confused about case statement because doesn't your case apply if anyone wants to do this? Like if I'm not a hedge fund, but I'm some other financial institution and I own a bunch of sovereign debt, I also can't use American courts, right?
There's pretty much no one except hedge funds who tries to do this.
Okay, and what happens when I sue American courts to force debtor countries to pay back their debt? Like, do they issue like a statement saying like, you better pay back your debt, or else?
I'm glad you asked that because it's really funny. So when the United States attempted to
That's not
compel,
funny, Jasper.
well, actually, you might find this entertaining. So there are two big examples when this has happened. One was in the DRC and one was in Argentina. So in the DRC, an American court ruled against the DRC. Huh?
What year?
I don't know, but Argentina, as a benchmark, was in 2011.
And this was before that.
Yeah. So in the DRC, the United States briefly attempted to seize the DRC's embassy, and I think it was France. This didn't work, but then we seized a bunch of other DRC assets that the United States could go after. And in Argentina, the United States briefly seized an Argentinian destroyer off a port in Africa before releasing it, and then seized a bunch of other Argentine assets that were in the United States.
Okay, and what was the outcome of that? Like, did they just give the destroyer to the creditors? Or did they, like, win the deal?
Well, well, so basically the way that it went was the destroyer was seized. Argentina was like, what's going on? The court was like, we're taking the property that you owe to Elliott Management,
Yeah.
LLP. And then Argentina was like, okay, we'll pay the debt.
Cool. Okay, so then they got the battleship back.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep. No, the hedge fund did not like park a destroyer in New York City.
It's tough to find parking in New York City. Okay. So that was the result in both of these cases, that they seized some stuff and then the country was like, oops, we'll pay.
Yep.
And did the payment come, it came with some amount of haircut in both cases, right?
Yeah, so it wasn't in full amount, but it was like substantially more than the haircut that was offered.
But
to
they
other
like, they
investors.
negotiated a deal within the US courts about how this would be paid in a manner that satisfied the relevant interests.
Argentina and the DRC weren't very happy about it. It was, so in Argentina's case, I think it was like Elliott Management purchased something like $5 billion worth of Argentinian debt and got $4.65 billion in payment from Argentina.
Pretty good deal.
Well, on what basis do the courts decide after you sue? And like, who am I suing? Am I suing the government?
Well, you're a hedge fund. You sue Argentina. Then you and Argentina go to court. You say, we have a contract to pay this debt. You look at the bond agreement. Then the court says, there was a contract here. Someone owes someone else money, and then renders a decision.
Like, on what basis? Like, are these decisions ever like, actually, Argentina's fine, even though you bought the debt?
No, other countries don't have a great track record so far in winning these sort of suits.
Has it ever ruled not in favor of the American investor?
I don't think so.
Okay, I have more questions. What
Yep.
courts do these go to if not American courts? Like, are you still able to sue somewhere, or you just like cannot sue, so you have no enforcement mechanism for this?
You could try suing in the court of the sovereign that issued the debt in the first place.
Right, but how? So those are your two options: the U.S. or that country.
Yep.
Like, what are if your lawyer were filing like a change of forum argument in either of these? What are the considerations that determine who can be a forum?
I'm actually not sure.
Aw.
Well, I've never had that asked before, but I think like the obvious alternative to suing in American courts would be suing in the courts of the country that issued the debt. Otherwise, there aren't really a lot of international arbitrators that take on this sort of thing.
Okay, and these bonds are denominated in what currency and sold on what exchanges?
The exchanges that sovereign debt is usually sold on denominated in the currency of the country that issued the debt.
Can you give me specific answers to both of the questions? Just for the two.
Argentinian dollars and bonds sold on like, I don't know the specific designation, but it's the market that countries use to trade debt with each other, as well as sell bonds to other investors.
So it's a US-based market, specifically New York City, right?
Like,
You want to say yes?
I'm actually unsure on the process of how other countries issue their bonds. Like, do other countries issue their bonds in New York City?
I mean, they're bought and sold on those exchanges.
Yeah, so their bonds sold on those exchanges.
Cool. I like it.
And to be clear, earlier you said like they ended up paying the debt, but what happened is that we seized their assets and kept them, correct?
Yeah.
So it's not actually the case that DRC's like have some money. It's like we pay DRC some stuff in the US. We're just gonna keep it. And the DRC's like, I guess that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, Sophia, to be clear, so the debt is traded on American courts or American markets in New York City, like presumably after it's been issued. But the initial issue of
Issued by another
right, but the issue of debt
bought and
is
sold on stock
a
exchange
contract.
pursuant-
Yeah, but it is a contract between the original investor, the hedge fund, and the sovereign country. And then from there,
Right,
the instrument
but it's mediated by U.S. Fed stock.
like once the instrument has been created, then it can be sold to American stock markets. It can be bounced over to London stock markets, that sort of thing.
We'll make some more.
Okay.
Okay. Is there anything else you were worried about? Yes, just the U.S. are down. And we clarified that if you refuse one haircut deal after you've bought sufficient stuff to qualify as a vulture, then you are denied access to American courts.
Yeah.
Cool.
Alright, we all good?
Sorry about all the questions.
No, you're good. Also, apologies if I start coughing. But I should be all good. Okay. So our first independent argument is that American courts shouldn't adjudicate this on principle. So even if the elements of a contract are present in a lawsuit to acquire assets of a foreign state, OP has the affirmative burden to prove that American courts should have the authority to intervene in the first place. We're going to say that on our side of the house, two elements must be present for legitimate trial to take place, and that neither one is present here. So first, the participants on either side must have agreed to the court as a domain to settle disputes. Courts have extraordinary power in the absence of democratic checks. The only way to check this anti-democratic power is to give litigants some say through political processes over the appointment and regulation of courts. However, foreign states clearly have no influence over the formation of the American judicial system. Foreign states and citizens cannot vote in American elections or appoint judges to American courts. Thus, we think that American courts are not an appropriate forum to judge the debt obligations of foreign states. But second, the court must have the power to compel the offending party. When courts enforce civil judgments against American citizens, the court is legitimate in doing so because it draws its authority from American law and can so punish violations of that law. The court is constituted by the law and cannot act outside it. So in this case, the court has no legal right to force foreign states to pay up. We say that states are sovereign. That is, that they have absolute domain within their borders because no other political actor has any claim to force there. When an American corporation purchases the debt of another country, they do so with the full knowledge that there is no legal obligation for that sovereign to pay them. A state may suffer from refusing to pay its debt, but that does not constitute justification for an American court to usurp the authority of the sovereign state. An American court is not equal to the American government, and so even the American sovereign cannot compel acts from another sovereign. And if I have time at the turn of this argument. So the impact of this argument is that even if OP could prove that the refusal to pay an obligation is harmful, American courts should not have the power to adjudicate them. Moreover, even if there is no philosophical principle, the United States should limit the extent to which it violates the sovereignty of other countries through its courts. If other countries behave in this way, America could be sued by other countries for civil damages, for instance the war in Iraq, by the courts of those countries. Opening the doorway for civil suits against sovereign countries is dangerous for America, and limiting it along the contours that we've explained is the only way to close it. Your question?
Yeah, so if someone from another country comes here and commits a crime, is it legitimate to punish them?
Yeah, we punish them under the law of the country in which they committed the crime because they harmed someone within that country's borders, so they consent to those laws. So our second independent argument is that vulture funds are terrible for recovery after debt crises. First, under this, we want to discuss how countries actually get out of sovereign debt crises. Sovereign debt crises occur when countries have built up a massive amount of debt and can't make interest payments or guarantee that holders of debt will get back the yields that the state agreed to pay on bonds. A state can get out of sovereign debt crises in two ways. First, a state can get debt relief from an international body. The IMF has given countries under debt distress loans worth billions of dollars in the past. This money is used to rehabilitate the country, building infrastructure and companies that stimulate economic growth. With healthier growth, countries can begin to collect taxes and scale back wasteful government programs, letting them pay back interest on debt and begin borrowing money again in the long term. But second, a state can restructure its debt with investors. When a country defaults, investors know that they aren't going to get their full money's worth back. So many of them will choose to negotiate gentler terms of payment on sovereign debt, accepting lower yields on bonds and haircuts on repayment of loans. This gives the defaulting country breathing room to recover without being weighed down by massive interest payments. But second on this point, we think that allowing vulture funds to use American courts destroys any abilities for countries for countries in debt crises to get out for 3 reasons. First, it means that the private investors will never choose to restructure debt. Investors take haircuts on their investments in sovereign debt because they know that there's no other avenue for them to get profit. However, when private investors always have the option of seeking recourse through American courts, will choose to do that rather than restructure debt because they can just seize the state assets of the debtor country instead of waiting for payment. Second, it means that any debt relief or aid packages from the international community to stimulate the economy of affected countries will just be given to vulture funds in order to pay off debt obligations. This means that international bodies like the IMF will be far less willing to give aid, since it'll just go straight to the pockets of hedge fund managers in New York City, rather than on building infrastructure in debt-stricken countries. But third, it means that foreign investment in the affected countries will go down. Companies and businesses will often move into debt-afflicted countries, because the cost of buying up assets like infrastructure and establishing businesses are relatively low. However, none of them will do that when vulture funds prey on distressed debt, because the assets of foreign companies that work out deals with debt-afflicted countries could be seized in order to pay off a debt obligation. So the impact of all of this is devastating. Countries that are in sovereign debt crises cannot get out and have to divert all of their relief funding towards paying off American hedge funds. This leaves their people suffering without welfare or jobs programs, and as long as any debt exists on the books, no international actor will offer these countries loans. This will devastate them for years without any exit option. But our third independent argument is that the use of American courts hurts our foreign relations. So even if vulture funds have some economic benefit, we think that the United States should still prevent them from using American courts if doing so hurts our foreign relations. When the vulture funds use American courts to extract wealth from countries in sovereign debt crises, those countries become more distrustful of the US for 2 reasons. First, they see the US as offering legal protection to people who are literally stealing money from starving people. America offers these hedge funds the weapons they use, and so the people who are hurt blame America. Second, the money taken from these countries goes to the United States, into places like California and New York where hedge funds are based. Argentinians who are suffering hyperinflation and unemployment will see America benefiting and say that the US has rigged the process in its favor. So what's the impact? First, there's much less ability for the US to negotiate with these countries. Even debt-stricken countries have resources to offer the US in economic trade and counter-terror, and these countries are already hostile towards American courts. Thus, they'll be more likely to back out of these agreements on opposite side of the house. Second, these countries are less willing to accept international aid, even if vulture funds wouldn't snap it up. The vast majority of international finance organizations that engage in debt relief and developmental assistance are maintained through American political connections and funding. When countries become more hostile towards America, they become more hostile towards the organizations that can help them escape debt crises. Just look at how Greeks have started to hate the IMF as a symbol of German oppression, and have been rejecting fiscal reforms as a condition of IMF aid because they hate Germany. That means that on opposite side of the house, they get fewer reforms and fewer acceptance of loans that could stop debt crises, prolonging the massive economic damage that these countries are already in. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I promise I won't miss anything this time.
The vast majority of arguments provided by the government speaks to the question of whether the verdicts in these cases are just. They do not speak to case statement, which is whether they should be adjudicated in American courts. We want to give you often speaking to that former point. We think we'll address why anything that lay linked to the latter is not unique and likely to be untrue in terms of the actual pragmatic consequences they want to produce. First, why is there an independent U.S. obligation to provide this sort of justice? Our first argument is the Constitution. Justice system comes from Article 3, and there are a couple of amendments that give you a right to a hearing in in civil and criminal cases of obscenely low amounts, because stuff was written at a point where the value of money just doesn't look like this today. That means you have a proactive right, insofar as you are legally recognized as a sort of entity, to be heard in US courts over this type of dispute. Specifically, a corporation has a legal status of a person. We've seen this and been frustrated by it over and over, but it is true as of the contract the US has created with the people underneath it. A couple impacts to this. First, you should prefer the Constitution as a source of obligations, because it determines what is good for the most people in the round, that even if there are people we leave out, those people's interests aren't aggregated somewhere else because it's on balance more representative than the other courts you would likely to go to. That means that the Constitution is the best measure of satisfying what people think is good. Second, if it is unconstitutional in the manner we described, which is extremely straightforward, it will be struck down, which means it will not have these sorts of impacts they care about. The only thing you do is, make a bunch of people unhappy and create the terrible economic consequences of people having a great indeterminacy about where they're able to do this. We think this indeterminacy is the worst impact to the kind of solution they want to bring, because it means people have the most risk and the least ability to evaluate what kinds of money they should be putting into the places that they're interested in. But even independent from the Constitution, we think there's a proactive right to justice that your government must provide to you. The legitimate status of government comes from its ability to provide a forum that is different from individuals just like fighting it out over what is or isn't just. That is, your central duty is to adjudicate the kinds of disputes that they are going to cut you off entirely from. We think this is key to your status as a government because only a monopoly on force, that is the idea that you alone decide private disputes between private individuals in a way that can be enforced by coercive power, means that you cannot just cut people off and distract them to someone outside yourself. We think the arguments about bad verdicts prove why this is necessary. That is, if you think certain outcomes are wrong, then you should make sure it's you deciding them so you can implement other laws to make sure that the verdicts will happen correctly. That kind of stuff is possible and constitutional. These are statutes about what is and isn't illegal, which are perfectly available remedies on our side house. Second, we think that you have a proactive obligation to guarantee this kind of justice, regardless of what you think the specific obligations are. And it is not a guarantee unless you are the one making the judgment. That is, if you're babysitting a child and you just ignore them for an hour and they happen to not get in trouble, we would not say that you guaranteed the safety of that child. Instead, you have to be proactively taking measures that ensure you do this. So if you think the US has any obligation to determine what justice is, then it must be an obligation they take on proactively. That means if they're interested in one party in the dispute, they have to be the venue where it's settling it, because, even though we think they're interested in both, that's another reason that applies there. But two more reasons why they have independent obligations to adjudicate this sort of dispute. First, they're largely responsible for the kinds of screwed up conditions that they want to adjudicate here. Remember that in the DRC, right, we assassinate one of the 12 people with a college degree who's going to lead the country coming out of the Cold War. We think that means we have a greater responsibility and a greater knowledge base to determine what is just within that. A contract, and the way contract law works, is not that if you sign something it is true, but rather if people agree to something on the same terms, then the government will enforce that agreement. We think they've made a lot of arguments about why you didn't agree to the thing on the same terms, and therefore there should be some sort of restructuring or some ability for the current leaders who are maybe more representative to do that restructuring. But we think secondarily, they're responsible for the rules under which hedge funds takes actions like this. That is, it would be possible for this to be banned by a government policy that said, you cannot do this. At the point where you are allowing the hedge funds to engage in this sort of action, you're responsible for valuing ramifications. That's an independent ethical obligation. You need to be the one determining the answer. But finally, we think that the worst case pragmatically is if there is no recourse for investors at all. They haven't shown you that every instance of this is going to be a harmful instance. That is, we think it is incredibly reasonable for investors to say, oh yeah, if the country suddenly wants to pay you a quarter as much as you owed them, you should not accept that haircut on your debt. We think they incentivize a system where countries will only ever offer really, really terrible deals because they think either the US will refuse the case or it'll go to domestic courts, which are just going to try to preserve their immediate stability because the actors within those courts are uniquely likely to view their short-term interests as overriding. They don't know if they're going to be around for a long term, so they won't view this as something where they have long-term incentives in being fair. This stops all deals, good and bad, because we think the ability of certain investors to come in and begin the negotiation makes people take these agents seriously as ones that are bound by rules of law and places where if you sign a deal, you're actually going to be able to get something out of that. Given that this is the only venue that anyone has proposed as something that has any legitimate claim, it is better on the whole for claims to be adjudicated there, even if there are some harms, even if it's not perfect. You need your court system to seem legitimate. Government case. Two overviews. First, the arguments that they give about the principal authority are, one, just unwarranted and obviously untrue on the basis of US courts. That is, we don't think that everyone individually agrees to the court in which they're heard, and we also don't think that the court's power of compulsion is separate in the cases where they do have the authority. That is, your ability to coerce someone is the same here as where, more later.
But second, we think that these arguments would imply that it's unjust to judge these cases everywhere, which means it is not possible for it to be a binary set of two conditions. Because it is also true that the company does not have votes within the other country, which is the place where they would be making this deal. That is, because they don't have this mechanism on the other side of the house, cannot be a comparative. The only thing we can ask is, where has there been more consent? So, a couple arguments with me. First, we're going to go down to compulsion first. First, this is the same as any other instance of state compulsion. That is, the state cannot get inside your head and change the actual decision you make. All it can do is change the material conditions of you making a decision. For instance, if you are fined and you decide not to pay that fine, after a certain amount of time, your wages will be garnished or you'll be sent to jail. If you are, you might be picked up off the street at some point, but this does not literally change your decision. It's only changing the array of options available to you. In the same way, if we take your destroyer, then your options have been constrained. Next argument, about agreeing to the specific court. First, we think that by issuing a type of bond that is created on the international argument, you have consented to the system. That is, you do not have to issue sovereign debt in this type, and the fact that you are not putting constraints on it that would keep it out of this market implies your consent. They're going to say there's been a more direct consent because the individual purchasers made a contract with the country. But we tell you, because that contract occurred on a U.S. stock exchange, that is, the definition of a vulture fund is that they bought it from a second party, not that they were the original buyer with the country. It means they're always closer to the rules of the U.S., which the first party knew that they could be judged by. We also think that that they consented to this through the benefits accrued. That is, you would not be able to do things like get the funding in particular if you were not letting it be traded in denominations like the dollar. People just don't invest in currencies that are unsecure, and they don't invest in places that don't have the backing of the U.S. court system. That means you wouldn't have gotten the money at all if the person buying the thing did not think that they would be able to adjudicate this dispute in the U.S. court. That's true of the first buyer, and it's also true of the vulture funds, which means it's an unjust change to the contract now to do it. Finally, they say this is bad because you might be sued for violations of sovereignty. First, there are no proactive justifications of why sovereignty is the be-all, end-all. Second, there's no reason given why these countries are responsive to their populaces. And we think that on net is more likely that the U.S. is. But third, the sovereign immunity distinction currently exists, and we evaluate those cases in court, so the slippery slope is false. That is, we do not let countries sue each other for things like, for the kinds of attacks that they're worried about. We do allow people to sue in order for private agents to get civil relief. Okay, next, the argument about how it's very bad for sovereign debts. We tell you that you can, they've given you a perfectly good first option, which is IMF debt relief. There is no reason given about why that's exclusively the same second stuff. Second, we tell you why we control the internal link to your accessing anything else, because people have to know that you'll have some kind of fair deal. Their counterfactual is just not correct at the point where there's no enforcement that people can trust. That's only a role only filled by the US. But finally, on the idea that it's bad for foreign relationships, those are just arguments about these substantive verdicts, which give you reasons why A, the court should be evaluating them because it has a proactive stake in whether the outcome is just, but B, US legislatures can solve those impacts by passing different laws about these statutory implications by requiring hedge funds to do different things. We think that America should take responsibility for what fabulous hedge funds get into, and we're very proud to oppose.
Here.
Is everyone ready? I want to start with an overview that I think addresses the key thrust of the opposition. So Sophia says, you would never actually purchase this debt in the first place unless there was an expectation of some third party adjudicating these claims. And that's why we need the United States to step in, because it is the most logical actor. However, we say that the law of the free market solves this. The reality is that when countries go into sovereign debt crises and begin giving out haircuts to their creditors, they get punished massively. They have to raise their bond yields in order to continue borrowing. People are far less likely to lend them money. The reality is that these countries go through massive amounts of economic stress if they even choose to refuse their investors a little bit. So we think that that is the expectation that purchasers of debt actually get. The expectation that countries will avoid this option at all costs, because it means that Argentina's credit rating will be downgraded to junk. So this also, by the way, deals with the argument that the United States should step in because, after all, hedge funds are Americans. There is a difference between the market in which goods are traded and the person who ought to be adjudicating these goods. This is why, for instance, contracts in the United States between private entities can include things like private arbitration. It's because the United States, these are US citizens, but they control within the contract who adjudicates the dispute. Same situation here. The initial contract that creates the debt obligation is between a private citizen and a sovereign government. It is not immediately traded in American courts. So we think that countries have an expectation that the instrument will be traded in American courts, but not necessarily adjudicated by the United States. Otherwise, you could have debt potentially adjudicated in Zimbabwe, the United Kingdom, and Russia, leading to a whole slew of complex laws that would crash the financial system. The reality is that it is either adjudicated in the court of initial issuance, or it is not adjudicated at all, but instead adjudicated by the free market. Now, let's go to their arguments. So they say that the United States is obligated to do this. There is a right to a hearing. So first of all, you do not have a right to a hearing if the claim is not in America or not in American courts. That's to say that sovereign nations obviously don't have a claim in American courts, but also hedge funds don't have a claim in American courts when they do bad acts on other countries' soil. That is to say that if there is a dispute in which the United States is attempting to compel Argentina to do something, that dispute is not occurring in Argentina, which is the same reason that American citizens who commit crimes in Britain cannot sue in American courts for relief from those crimes. So we think that there is no constitutional obligation to do this. Second of all, it is clearly true that the United States can alter the terms of this arrangement historically. So this means that there is no constitutional obligation. The United States has in the past altered the torts that American citizens can bring against foreign citizens. There was a Supreme Court case the other day on whether or not foreign citizens can bring torts in American courts, and the United States in JASTA, like the law that allowed United States citizens to sue Saudi Arabia, passed that law 2 years ago. So if all of these can be done through statutory measures, then there is clearly no constitutional obligation. Then they say the indeterminacy here actually leads to uncertainty in markets. But I think that our side has actually leads to more certainty in markets, the reasons outlined in the second on-case point. You cannot get stable investment in these countries and stable issuance of debt unless you ban American courts from doing this. Then they say the government must adjudicate these disputes because it is a monopoly of force. We say that a government has a monopoly of force within its borders, but importantly, the government has no monopoly of force outside of its borders. The law of sovereigns says that countries have independent political authority within their borders, and absent extraordinarily egregious actions, other countries cannot step in. The basis for this in international law is stuff like the right to protect, that you can only intervene in another country's affairs unless that country is engaging in, like, literal genocide. We don't think that the bar for that is met here. These countries are just refusing to pay back their debt, and doing so in a way that countries have done for hundreds of years. The United States would literally be using military force in order to seize assets. You saw it in POCs, this is what happens. So we don't think that the American government has authority outside its borders, ergo it should not enforce these contracts. They say that there is a proactive obligation because the United States was responsible for doing things. The example here is we assassinated someone in Congo, therefore we now have the authority to go in and force Congo to pay back its debt. American political intervention has been bullying in the past, and we don't just think that going into a country for any reason justifies us compelling the current government there. We think that these governments are sovereign and can make their own decisions on whether or not to pay back debt. The harms will fall on them, but it is up to American hedge funds whether or not to invest. But second of all, we say that the United States is not responsible in any conditions. The reality is that a lot of countries that are experiencing economic distress in the manner that we've described are countries in the European Union. Stuff that, whereas there's a monetary union but no fiscal union, changing interest rates means that countries go into sovereign debt crises that they can't recover from. Where was America in all this? Certainly it wasn't state action that caused this, it was the action of the private market. And we don't think that the American government should step in there and have the authority to do that when it wasn't the American government using its political authority in this manner. They say that we are responsible for hedge funds since they're American citizens. Look, American hedge funds do really screwed up things overseas, but that doesn't mean that we ought to adjudicate them. The reality is that crimes committed in other countries should be adjudicated in those countries. And contracts worked out in other countries, with other countries serving as the issuer of the debt, doesn't mean that it is not necessary for the United States to arbitrate in this reason. We say, cut these citizens loose, they don't deserve the help of American courts. Then they say, countries will only ever engage in bad lending practices if you fail to do this in American courts. Here's the problem. There are tons of incentives against doing this. The reality is that if you can't get debt relief from the IMF because they're afraid that their money might go to a hedge fund, your citizens will revolt and you will undergo massive amounts of economic stress. If you refuse to give optimal haircuts to your investors, your credit rating will go from pretty bad after a sovereign debt crisis to literal junk and unrecoverable for decades. What political leaders would have the incentives to refuse to give investors a decent enough haircut? Haircuts only have to be severe enough, only to the extent that countries can begin paying revenue to the extent that countries can spend revenue in order to stimulate their economy. Realistically, the amounts we're talking about are like 70%, 80%, not the draconian amounts they're suggesting countries would be incentivized on their side. Now let's go back to the on-case. So they say the mechanism does not exist on the other side, so there is a binary. We think that the mechanism that we've identified is the law of the free market and law of sovereign states. It is anarchy, the Wild West, but we think that there are mechanisms in place that allow countries to do this. Then they say that America does have the ability to coerce, but that is not a legal justification. We say that American military force ought to be only applied with the consent of the American people. In this case, it is American judges who are unelected officials exercising military force in a way that doesn't conform with America's strategic interests. This is going to lead to massive political backlash, and it's also going to lead to the American military being employed in ways that don't align with the views of the American people. Then they say, this is like a necessary constraint, and they say, we don't let other countries sue the United States. I actually think the slippery slope that we've identified in the PMC actually does apply. When American courts have the authority to adjudicate these disputes elsewhere, it means that Americans think that we have the ability to sue other countries. That was the whole controversy of allowing 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia, massively damaging for our foreign relations with that country. We think that the American government should not permit violations of sovereignty in this way because it prevents American citizens from executing their views in foreign policy through statutory and other measures. Then we tell you that it is terrible for recovery. This argument is mishandled. Sophia says, IMF debt relief is not mutually exclusive to engaging with American courts. But it is mutually exclusive for the reasons that are outlined under this point. First, private investors will never invest and will never actually seek to take haircuts when they can always seek relief through American courts. And there are good reasons to believe that they'll always win in American courts. We explain in POCs that they've never lost. And that's because there's a massive disparity of information between the country that is being sued and American investors. Second of all, debt relief doesn't work because the IMF realizes that all of the money that it gives to these countries will just be siphoned off to pay Elliott Management and Wall Street. We also explain that the only way that countries can get FDI in this situation is to create cooperative partnerships between private investors from overseas and the country in question that is going through a sovereign debt crisis. But that will never happen because those private investors will now be afraid that a hedge fund might seize their assets that they just invested into that country. The impact here is devastating. It means that these countries go through massive amounts of economic cycles, and although the American government has obligations to its own citizens, the scale of human suffering that we are discussing here is directly America's responsibility, because it is done through American courts. Therefore, we think that you should let Argentinians not starve in their cribs. This is a very simple argument. Lastly, we explain foreign relations. They say that we can use statutory measures, but statutory measures will never work when judges are doing this. The reason that Malaysia has been in economic distress since 1998 is because those countries still blame George Soros for extracting the wealth from their country. As a consequence, even if we have better and improved relations with them, there is no reason to believe that we would actually be able to improve it or for these countries to get economic relief. We're proud to propose.
The MG loses the round when they just give us some reasons why these specific types of courts might not be democratic or might not be in the interest of these countries without actually responding to Sophia's warrant. Sophia's warrant is that you do not have to issue sovereign debt in the first place. You can put riders on your contracts that say that you cannot sell these bonds in US countries. You can basically decide not to let these people own this debt in the first place, but insofar as you let that happen, you consent to all these things. So it doesn't matter if you think these judges are unelected, because you knew that when these sovereign courts happened, and if there is precedent of this happening before, we think it is a de facto agreement to allowing this to happen. But additionally, what they don't engage with is what's actually happening here, because the whole time they just talk about how this is always United States military force and they are always overriding your sovereignty. But newsflash, none of the examples that you gave actually deal with that. The specific examples that you talk about one, approaching a ship owned by Argentina in literally international waters, which is not invading their country, or two, seizing assets that literally already exist in your country. In no case are we ever going to literally put boots on the ground in another nation because it's just too costly, which means that we are only not going to respect it, like literally the protection of their assets in our country, or we affront a ship that is in international waters, which we think is perfectly acceptable because it's just about using a bargaining chip, which is specifically what Sophia tells you. We are not making you do anything, we are simply changing your incentives. Where does that leave us? I'm going to go through the off case and explain why we're ahead. So first, in terms of the U.S. constitutional obligation, what do they say? All they say is that there are other ways in which you can actually alter, there are other ways in which we have altered specifically which torts you can actually bring to the court in general. But the question is that specific case is about what torts you can bring, what actually constitutes a harm. Because it is fair whether or not what we should ask is illegal, what is actually bad enough for courts to actually adjudicate on behalf of a particular person. But if we know that someone is being defrauded of their money, and as Sophia tells you, even for extraordinarily small monetary amounts, that is always a reason that that you should actually be able to see a court, that means that it's not fair to adjudicate based on where that harm has happened, because your obligation is to the person first, which means that they don't respond to the constitutive argument that Sophia gives you, which is that the people are the country, they are your first obligation. So if it is the case that you know that they have been harmed, it is not fair to arbitrarily not protect them because they have been harmed by a different kind of actor. Why is this important? One, because it means that first, there are a ton of people they are actively defrauding because there are already cases that are in the courts right now who are guaranteed the ability to get their money back and they no longer have their cases processed. That's unacceptable because they bought the bonds before this policy was passed, which means that you are lying to them, which is unacceptable. The second problem is they just don't respond to the actual impact of this argument. That even if you think it's justified because you have other obligations to other nations, they don't deal with the pragmatics of it, which is that if it's just going to be struck down, you have no offense on your side of the house, you're only making people unhappy, and you're only increasing the indeterminacy of whether or not people actually want to buy bonds in the first place. Secondly, on a proactive right to justice, what do they say? The first thing that they say is that, look, the reason you're not allowed to use any force outside of your own borders because of the fact that there's this principle of sovereignty. And he gives the example of the right to protect, but the right to protect is something that we do because sovereignty would exist, but they still do not explain why sovereignty matters or exists. There's literally no warrant given. They just explain other things that are theoretically based on sovereignty. But additionally, if sovereignty is based on your own borders and none of their examples are based on going into someone else's borders, it's unclear why we would do this in the future. Like, we can freely move our ships around however we want. If we want to blockade their freight, if we want to blockade their trading ships or whatever, I think we're totally allowed to do this because we have not used military force in the past. But when they talk about America not causing all the economic problems in other nations, that is not actually offense for them because we still can be some scenarios where America is obviously responsible. So why does this matter? The reason why this argument matters is that Sophia tells you if you think the problem is that these cases are not always being decided correctly, it is not the case that you can just shut down your courts. Why is this true? Because they do not contest the weighing that Sophia says, which is that if you owe people justice, you have to give them the potentiality to get justice. It doesn't matter if sometimes it's wrong. Because right now, even in our existing justice system, judges sometimes make the wrong decision. In the criminal justice system, sometimes they're found guilty, even though you were actually innocent. The important thing is you need a court to be able to, for it to even be possible to provide justice, which means that on their side of the house, it is literally impossible for anyone to get what they want. And as long as there is even one case where you actually deserve to get this money back, then we are winning because we get a better decision. But finally, it is wrong to your own people. It is not acceptable to say we should not stand behind people that are hurting others because these companies decided to invest here and they don't deserve to steal their money. The reason is you let them do it. You didn't set a law that said that they couldn't do it, which means that they deserve your protection. Insofar as you let them do it and you told them you would protect them, it is unacceptable to back out on that because your first obligation to them, which is the weighing Sophia gives you about people constitute the nation, it is your greatest obligation. No. But let's on to the overview here, because what they basically say is that, like, you need to be able to purchase these bonds, but it would happen on either side because you would never actually ask for high haircuts, because then this would scare investors off in the future. There's a couple reasons why this doesn't make sense. The first is that you can always ask for haircuts because they know if you're going to declare bankruptcy anyways, they will always accept the haircut because it's better to get some money back instead of no money. But also, the only reason why you wouldn't want to, the only reason why they get any money back in the first place is existing court systems like ours. In terms of this idea that they have about how contracts have to include private arbitration, and otherwise everyone would have their own court. One, it's just not feasible that small nations will be forming their own courts in the future and trying to make declarations on others. But also, we're fine with a world in which a ton of small nations are like, look, you violated our contract and you really owe us this money. The vast majority of them won't act on it. But also, you're fine to actually take their assets that are within your own borders. Let's go on to the on case. First argument. I kind of answered this in my overview already, where I talked about why it is perfectly acceptable to hold them accountable to any court system because they fundamentally consent to it insofar as they allow them to be sold here. But additionally, I think the bigger problem here is that the vast majority of the time you're just seizing assets, which is totally fine. Because if there's DRC property in my nation, I am actively spending government resources protecting the property and saying only DRC can do things to this area. I can just choose not to protect that property right anymore, but it's not an active right of violence against this nation. It is literally saying, you have hurt my people, and in the interest of protecting them, I'm going to help you. The reason why my POI was actually incorrect, but luckily they went along with it, which means that they're not actually engaging with the debate, is that this is not about punishing someone after the fact. It is about the fact that someone is actively being hurt and defrauded, and you can prevent it by taking the money and giving it to them. We say you have to do it, which is why if someone came from Britain here and started to hurt me, even though they might be extradited later to be punished, the police right now could stop them because they can prevent the harm from happening. Next one is arguing about restructuring. The biggest thing here is that what they say is that no international actors will actually offer loans in the first place. But there's a couple of problems here. First, we think that the United States have a specific incentive not to rule in favor
Last chance.
of the vulture funds if it is the case that they would actually want to offer a loan. The reason why this is true is their third argument that says the United States has the biggest stake in places like the IMF, which give a lot of money. So they would never, with a significant amount of power over the IMF, they would never like give a loan and then allow themselves to hurt themselves by having their courts then rule that you have to give that money to your corporations. But additionally, these loans are actually not going to go to these companies because insofar as you would never literally invade a country to take this money back, if you give the country a loan, they're probably just going to spend it on their own roads. You're not actually going to you're not actually going to interfere with that process, and you're just going to keep doing things like trying to seize assets that exist outside of the country, which is totally fine. But the most important argument here is that when your economy is down, people are going to be starving for 10 or 15 years on either side of the house. That means the most important thing here is to prevent economic collapses in the first place. The way you prevent economic collapses is by making sure that when you need money to feed your people, when you need to jumpstart your economy, you can actually get people buying your bonds. They don't buy their bonds on their side of the house because people know that these bonds are really risky because if they start going down in value, there will be huge haircuts and you can't get any money for it. On our side of the house, investors know that even if the country starts to falter, it will be the case that they can still get some amount of money from it because these vulture funds like to buy it, which only happens on our side of the house where they know they can get money back. That means only on our side do we help nations that are about to have economic crashes actually get money in the first place that prevents these crashes from happening. Last on this stuff about how it has bad international relations, we think this is reliant on the pragmatics because obviously if it's good for the country, you can justify it, but also countries won't actually be that mad if America is doing this because they haven't done it to you before if it's your first time asking for a loan.
Recognize that Jasper's arguments about the injustice of the US system do not address the comparative, which is, you have to get justice somewhere, what is the correct forum for you to get that? The only thing they tell you is that it's just going to be the free market. The problem is the free market working is contingent on court enforcement. Even if you think that they've given you reasons why the free market would punish you without any threat of court enforcement, our arguments outweigh uncertainty because that is what happened in the status quo, and on violations of actual promises because the deals made in the status quo were told that they would be backed up by court promises. That means you are actively giving a certain rights violation in their world. Next, they give you a little bit of material about how you could get private arbitration, but we tell you why that is not a justice system in the relevant sense, and why the government cannot allow it to exist at the point where the function that they serve is to provide a monopoly on force and to adjudicate this kind of dispute. That means it does not serve the system of being adjudicated by a justice system, because even that system of private arbitration has to be okayed by a higher court system that is not equivalent to taking it out of the issue. So let's look at the actual comparative, because I think they concede a couple of crucial arguments here. That is, we have told you why a bunch of their arguments are non-unique, that the US companies have not consented to be ruled by these other banks, by these other governments, so it cannot be the case that it's just for them to have to seek recourse within their borders. What then is the comparative that they concede that is going to be the most important issue here? It is that when you issue a bond, you set the kinds of rules about where it can be traded, and you take on those benefits on the basis of also taking on certain risks. That is, you can be taken to court in the relevant forums. We tell you that the government could have restricted this, the buyer could not have. We tell you the buyer's interaction happened in a US court system, in a US adjudicated system. That is, it is two US individuals or two people who are regulated by the US stock market selling to each other in New York, which means it meets all the criteria of the kinds of cases that they say it can bring. Even if you're worried about some cases of bringing torts against foreign individuals, we've shown you why this is the wrong remedy here, because there are a bunch of cases where you will be legitimately adjudicating it. The only other thing they tell you is some arguments about sovereignty. But remember, there has been no warrant to date about why sovereignty is a legitimate principle. We tell you why, on the comparative, the US is more representative, that is, has the only real claim to representing people than the countries with which it will be negotiating. Even if you don't think that's very compelling, it's true for the purposes of the graph. We also tell you the obligation is what you promised it, and this outweighs for two reasons. First, certainty. That is, these are the conditions under which the deal would have been made. They would not have been made otherwise. You cannot know whether it would be in a position to evaluate any of those harms absent this. But second, you allowed the hedge funds to engage in these deals. This is the more important half of the empirics. That is, you did not ban this via law, so you take on responsibility for the interactions that happen between people in the US. Even if you think some jurisdictions should be out of the picture, it is not sufficient for them to win the off case because we tell you you're violating an obligation to some people. If you're worried about those cases, Jasper's giving you reason why they'll be thrown out of court. We're not worried about that. We also tell you that so what this means is that no arguments about consequences matter. Because no one has explained why you have an obligation to do something beyond what you've promised to your citizens, and you never promised your citizens or the rest of the world that you'll make their lives really nice. But if you think that consequences matter at all, then you have to believe the guaranteeing argument, which is the babysitting example. That is, if you have an obligation to make sure things go well for people, it needs to be evaluated in your courts. Because even if it would be maybe nicer to push it off onto other people, you cannot make sure the right thing happens. This is the same example that I told you earlier, that if you make a promise you're going to take care of a kid and you turn your back and it happens that they played in a fun and safe place, you have not fulfilled your duty. In the same way, if you think any of the impacts they talk about are things the US can be responsible for, you vote off because you have to believe that you're the one who should be doing that. We tell you why statute can change the options available to the players and the outcomes of the courts because it can make certain actions legal or illegal. So everything they tell you about this ruining the economics of other countries is the reason why legislatures will change the availability of these actions legally. We also tell you you can't access any relief without the guarantee of courts you've had before. That means we outweigh any specific impacts and predictions that they make. First on probability, but second on reversibility. Because we've told you not just that other laws would be able to solve this problem, but also why those laws are likely to happen given the impacts that they outlined. Because no one wants it, you'll pass the laws that we have clearly identified that would make the relevant cases not able to be evaluated in these courts. We think the US has an obligation to guarantee the justice that it promised, that they cannot talk about any of the goods or harms they discuss unless it is true that you are backed up by the threat of court enforcement. We're very proud to oppose.
Points of overview. First, we told you in PMC that OP had the positive burden of proving an obligation, not just permissibility, obligation. Because they went all in on obligation, we say that first, if we were able to win pragmatics, we will in the debate, as I'll explain in a second, but all they have done is proven permissibility that is not enough for them to win the round. Second point of overview, the weighing that Jasper gives in MG, which they do not compute.
We think this claim that our arguments are permissibility arguments are new.
I mean,
It was a line out of PMC.
We've heard the word obligation before. We think that any discussion of our arguments being permissibility claims is a new argument.
I think each individual member of the panel will take it under consideration.
The dropped weighing that Jasper gives in the MG when he says that the weight of actively harming these countries outweighs any kind of nebulous, indeterminate right to sue that we have proven that it is not in the Constitution, and they drop a lot of the arguments from the MG regarding that. We said that they heavily outweigh all of the principled arguments that they have been making throughout the round. We tell you that these obligations to these other countries not only do they outweigh, but they are also independent of the obligations that you have to your own citizens, because we've told you that hedge funds aren't babies. They are perfect experts on things such as finance, and they know what they're getting into when they're negotiating with these countries. So it isn't a child. It's like you're leaving a full-grown adult to feed themselves, and then the adult is saying, I don't want to, I'm going to starve to death willingly. Huge difference. So the first question is there an obligation? It's going to take a while, but it's really important because if we win it, then we win the round because we've won so many of the pragmatic arguments that they didn't want to engage with. So we tell you that yes, because you have bought the debt of a sovereign, and you bought it of another country, and you consented to their laws, because as we say, in the POI that they ask at the start of the round, that when you go into another country and you decide to hurt someone in that country, that person is consented to the laws of that country, so when you hurt them, they are protected by the laws of that country. What we tell you is that there is no agreement or consent within these contracts, and there's also no ability to compel it straight out of PMC. From OP, they say the Constitution, no, we've told you that there's the SCOTUS case regarding why it is that it had to have happen within the United States for the US to be able to arbitrate on it. We also see there has to be an agreement. They talk about indeterminacy, but the problem is that we've told you why it is that we actually stabilize markets because we actually allow countries that are debt-stricken to get out of that debt, and why it is that we have an interest in getting them out of that debt because we can actually have relations with them and they can contribute to global economy. We've also shown why it is that it isn't going to get struck down because we told you why it's not unconstitutional, so why would it get struck down? Then Op says you have a proactive duty. We've told you why it is that you're not protecting hedge funds because they know what they're getting into and they are perfect experts on things such as financial transactions. And the MO says, well, we aren't actually going to be putting boots on the ground in this situation, but newsflash, things such as Argentine ships and things like the embassy of the DRC are within those sovereign states. So what else are we going to do if we're seizing assets? We're going to be putting boots on the ground, we're going to be bullying them, and when they drop our argument about like foreign relations, then they essentially are conceding the fact that when we do, these countries are going to hate us, we're not going to be able to have those strong foreign relations that we'd like to have. Then the MO says, well, we should have banned it when it happened, and this is like something that like Jasper explains the clear distinction between permitting a sale and arbitrating a sale, and they like, just refuse to engage with that. Because what we tell you is that the arbitrator has been the market, and that's what it's been forever, and it has worked because when you enter into these kinds of risky deals, and when you're a country that is going into a debt crisis and you sell off all your debt, you understand what's happening, as does the hedge fund. The problem is that the US is perfectly justified in permitting for this to occur because they know the market will solve and they know they don't have the ability to compel, but the problem is that they don't have to actively arbitrate because of that distinction. Then
We think that at the top of the MG, we heard an argument that the free market solved for the adjudication problem. We think that the distinction between permitting a sale and arbitrating the sale is a new argument in EPMR.
It was the analogy at the top of MG that the United States permits some contracts to take place in the United States, for instance, private arbitration, but does not necessarily always adjudicate them as a result. So this is analogous.
Each individual member of the panel will consider it.
And they make this argument about how you have to deliver justice. We've told you why it is that there's different jurisdictions, and they try to collapse on this thing about how it's like, oh, different because it's an after the fact, whereas they're trying to prevent things from happening. We've told you why it is that the United States is able to permit these sales from happening, but again, it's the argument that we just made. And so we tell you that if you don't actually have jurisdiction, then it doesn't matter. Then the MO says, well, countries can just force investors to take haircuts, and they can like compel them to take haircuts. But no, because if they no one is going to be able, no one is going to want to invest if they are always having to restructure all these bad deals, and this is not. It's going to be really problematic for these countries. Then in the LOR, they talk about why it is that you must have the courts do this. We've told you why it is that you have no obligation. So there's no positive obligation. So the only way that they could possibly win this round is that they prove that it's optimal and that it's pragmatic. We've told you why it is that, again, under these principled arguments, why the free market is the one that is going to solve. But again, look to the weighing that Jasper gives you on why harms outweigh. So the second question is who actually limits harms? When we win this in a minute, we're going to win the round. So when they say that they do not get the IMF getting aid because the IMF is literally run by a European director who doesn't have any kind of say in politics, right? The MO makes this argument about how you can compel the IMF, but again, they are independent of the United States. They have a European director, and they're only going to arbitrate on things that they like using their objectivity, not using subjectivity. The MO says, well, this is not unique. There's going to be no help on either side, but we say no. There is going to be help on our side because when a country wants to either invest or give aid, they know it doesn't go to a hedge fund. And then the MO says that well, bonds aren't going to be bought on side gov, but we tell you that investors are going to stop buying as soon as they see cracks appearing. Cracks appear so much more on their side of the house, they never show why it is that an investor actually would go in. We also told you why it is that on our side of the house, countries can just do things like offering to yield higher bonds. They drop all of our foreign relation arguments, so even if you don't think you have any obligations to other countries, which we've shown they will cripple these countries, then you still ought to pragmatically help the US and their foreign relations for all these reasons. Proud to propose.